Welcome back to my series on First Peter, where we read every chapter of First Peter until we understand the letter a little bit better. We are almost done. We are on chapter 4, verses 12 through 19. John Wesley taught that trials can become instruments that God uses to shape a believer into deeper holiness. Now, that doesn't mean that suffering is good itself. It means that suffering doesn't have to be wasted. And Peter says something very similar in 1 Peter chapter 4. He tells them that they shouldn't be shocked when the fire comes. Not because fire doesn't hurt, but because following Christ never promises us that we're going to be spared from hardships. So the question becomes, when the fire comes, will it drive me away from Christ or closer to him? Let's start. Verse 12 says, "Dear friends, don't be surprised when the fiery ordeal comes among you to test you as if something unusual were happening to you." Peter begins with a command that seems almost strange. Don't be surprised. You know, most of us are surprised by suffering. We pray, we obey, we try to do what's right, and when hardship comes, we wonder what went wrong. Peter reminds us that a fiery trial is not evidence that God has abandoned us. In fact, he calls it a test. Fiery ordeal comes among you to test you. Earlier in this letter, Peter compares your faith being tested by gold being refined by the fire. See, fire reveals what is real, what is lasting, and what can survive. So honestly, the question isn't, how quickly can I get out of this? It's more like, what is this test revealing about my faith? And then in verse 13, he says, "Instead rejoice as you share in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may also rejoice with great joy when his glory is revealed." See, Peter's not telling everybody to enjoy the pain. He's saying that there can be joy in knowing that our suffering places us on the same road that Christ once walked. Jesus was rejected. Jesus was mocked. Jesus suffered while doing what was right. So suffering for faithfulness doesn't immediately mean that we're on the wrong road. Sometimes it reminds us who we're following. And Peter looks beyond the suffering to the day when Christ's glory will be revealed. When the trial has ended, Christ's glory does not. And then in verse 14, he says, "If you are ridiculed for the name of Christ, you are blessed because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you." Peter gets very specific here. If you're ridiculed because you belong to Christ, do not assume that you've lost favor with God. See, the world may be looking at you and say, "Oh, she's losing, he's losing." But Peter reminds us that the Spirit of God is still within us. So that means that hardship is not proof of God's absence. Sometimes the presence of Christ is most precious when everyone else is absent, when the approval of everyone else disappears. And then in verses 15 through 16, he says, "Let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or a meddler."